Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to tune in and support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, November 11th, 2023. We begin with our dear sister Genesis, riding the waves of history, giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Anthony Jerry, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of California at Riverside. Professor Jerry is also the author of the book, Blackness in Mexico, Afro-Mexican Recognition and the Production of Citizenship in the Costa Chica. And these two will be in conversation today about just that. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores from the Garifuna Museum of Los Angeles. Today is day 2 of the 2023 Garifuna International Indigenous Film Festival, and this interview will give you the historical context needed to tell you why you should be there. The festival was founded in 2012 with a mission to preserve the values and aspirations for all indigenous people and Garifuna cultures. The Garifuna Film Festival's mission is to specifically support the preservation of all indigenous cultures in the world through art and film. So join them today for lots of films, panels, performances, and more happening right now until 10 p.m. at the Electric Lodge in Venice. For more information, visit GarifunaFilmFestival.com. That's GarifunaFilmFestival.com. And stay tuned for some history of the Garifuna people coming to you from Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores. We would also like to announce and invite you out to the Paddle Out for Peace in support of Sudan and Palestine, happening tomorrow, Sunday, November 12th. We will be gathering at 10 a.m. at the Santa Monica Beach Tower 24, located at 2030 Ocean Avenue. The paddle out will begin at 11 a.m. and all are welcome. So please come out and show your love and support for the Sudanese people and the Palestinian people. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring drummers from the Le Baja Drum Center in Hopkins, Belize, Roy Hargrove, Herbie Hancock, Larry Fuller, Mary Lou Williams, Pharoah Sanders, and Grant Green. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation. And stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Anthony Jerry.
This is Sister Janice with this week's African Historical Drumbeat Calendar. November 15th, 1998, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, crossed over to the ancestor world. Kwame, an African born in Trinidad, organized in the U.S. and Africa during the Civil Rights, Black Power, and Pan-African movement, was an ardent proponent of Pan-Africanism and internationalism and a founder member of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. November 15th, 1884 through 1885, the Berlin Conference in Germany, where the European powers and the U.S. meet to divide up Africa and African people, totally ignoring the wishes of a quarter of the world's population. The English, French, Germans, Italians, Dutch, U.S., Portuguese, and Spanish divided Africa and the peoples of Africa to build their economic and political basis, to establish themselves as world powers at the expense of Africa and African people. November 15th, 1988, the Palestinian Liberation Organization proclaims independence for the Palestinian state from the U.S.-backed settler colony of Israel. November 15th, 1930, Mother Jones. When asked where she lived, she said, "Wherever there's a fight." Irish working class Shiro, she organized against child labor, coal miners, and fought against capitalist exploitation. She was opposed to the women's suffrage movement because it was primarily a privileged women's movement that she felt would divert working class women from the fundamental contradiction of the class struggle that gave birth to women's oppression capitalism. November 16, 1892, the African country of Dahomey, under Behazin, defeated French in their ongoing efforts at freedom from slavery and colonialism. November 17, 1970, Maggie Kuhn founded the Grey Panthers, an organization devoted to fighting discrimination against the elderly. The organization, at the height of its membership, had 8,000 members and worked to change bad transportation for seniors, discriminator banking, and housing for the elderly. November 19, 1968, Modibo Keïta, a revolutionary, democratically elected Pan-Africanist Prime Minister of the West African nation of Mali, home of the world's first university, Timbuktu, was overthrown by a French-backed coup d'etat. November 19, 1930, Griselio Torresolo, a Puerto Rican-born nationalist woman and participant in the November 4, 1950 uprising against the U.S. continued colonial occupation of Puerto Rico, was arrested in their effort to assassinate President Truman. November 20th, 1695, the National Black Consciousness Day in Brazil, memorializing the death of the greatest slavery resistance fighter in the Western Hemisphere, Zumbi. November 20th, 1972, ZANU of Zimbabwe, the leading revolutionary party, launches guerrilla warfare against the rogue European settler regime of Ian Smith and its U.S. and Britain-backed supporters. November 22nd, 1930, the Nation of Islam was founded. The Nation of Islam is a continuation of the tradition of African nationalism and organization of Martin Delany, Noble Drew Ali, and Marcus Mosiah Garvey. The Nation of Islam was founded by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which was provided leadership including Malcolm X, Khalid Muhammad, Minister Louis Farrakhan. It is the largest organization of African people in the United States. November 22, 1970. The African masses in Guinea defeated the Portuguese invasion and attempted overthrow of the democratically elected government of Revolutionary Socialist Guinea, home base for African revolutionary freedom fighters from throughout the world. This has been Sister Janice from the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar of Freedom Now.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Anthony Jerry, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UC Riverside, and the author of Blackness in Mexico, Afro-Mexican Recognition and the Production of Citizenship in the Costa Chica. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles. Professor Jerry.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So how did you get involved in this topic, and what does your book largely concern?
Sure. So I grew up in Southern California, and I would say sort of the late 80s and 90s was sort of defining sort of moments in my youth. And at that time in Southern California, one of the several things I think that was made clear to me growing up in the area that I did is that Black and Mexican were mutually exclusive. That is to say that to be one was to not be the other, right? And so I grew up sort of understanding that sort of political and cultural sort of social fact, right? And then as an undergraduate at San Diego State University, I decided to take a study abroad course. And I was interested in migration and patterns of migration of indigenous peoples from Mexico to the United States. And so I went to Oaxaca, and a professor took us as a group to the Costa Chica. And I got off the small little bus, and I saw Black folks all around, at least what I identified as Black folks, right? So much so that, I thought how much they looked like, folks from my own family, right? And so I started to wonder why it was that I had never heard about Black folks in Mexico growing up in Southern California, right? Thinking that I understood what Mexicanness meant, right? Or sort of being familiar, right, with that in my environment. And so then the question for me was, well, then how did folks get here, right? And what's the experience, the contemporary experience for Black folks in Mexico? So that sort of set me on that path. At that time, Black folks in Mexico, or I should say, African descendants in Mexico, weren't considered a unique cultural group in Mexico, right? They weren't recognized as a group apart in Mexico. But in 2000, in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, activists started pushing harder, right, to get sort of resources from the government. The government started responding in a particular way. And in 2010, 2011, the Mexican government really decided in earnest to start the process of what I call official Black recognition in Mexico. And so my book then is about that process, right? The idea of Blackness in Mexico, or the title Blackness in Mexico, is a little bit misleading because my book's not necessarily about, Black culture in Mexico or particular sort of Black experiences within Mexico. Rather, my book is about the role that Blackness has played historically in Mexico, in producing all citizens or all sort of, subjects within Mexico. And then in the contemporary moment, right, what that history or how that history then impacts the potentials or possibilities for expressing one's Blackness in Mexico in the contemporary moment.
So can you tell us what part of Africa do Black people in Costa Chica, which by the way is not far distant from Acapulco and, as you say, Oaxaca, what
Right.
part of Africa do they come from?
So my understanding, historians have sort of made it clear that Black folks came to what was then New Spain, right, by way of Spanish interaction with the Portuguese slave trade, from central and western Mexico, right. There's folks now who are more interested in that question of sort of the specific origins of African descendants in Mexico and what specific places they what sort of destinations, I guess, right, they would have come from. So for example, I met a person, I can't recall her name, but in the early days of my research, she was collecting DNA samples from folks, right, to be able to try to trace back the specific locations that African enslaved peoples had come from Mexico. I mean, from Africa, but in general, it's Central and Western Africa.
And what about their voting patterns? Do they tend to vote for the party of the current leader, AMLO, or do they vote for the opposition, the PRI, or what?
Yeah, I would hate to sort of lump all Black Mexicans or African descendant folks together, right? There's several different communities of African descendants in Mexico. You've got Oaxaca, you've got Guerrero, which is sort of comprises the Costa Chica. You've got Veracruz, you've got the state of Mexico, and then you've got some other smaller populations throughout the country, right? And I think these folks, mostly because Black folks in Mexico are rural folks, they engage more, I think, locally, right, with local politics, and I think their interests are more focused on what's going on in the immediate neighborhood. I know that as Blackness in Mexico becomes more popular and Black folks in Mexico are getting more visibility, there is sort of a solidification, I would say, that's happening, right, of a group, right, a larger political group of Black folks. But I don't know that that's happened quite yet. And so I'd hesitate to sort of, really sort of state the voting patterns, right, in the same way that we might recognize in the United States or other places in the diaspora.
So in terms of where they fit in the economy, you suggest that they're rural, which I take it means they're involved in agriculture, much more so than proletarianized work.
Sure.
What kind of agriculture, for example?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? I think for many Black folks in the Costa Chica, I think rather than agriculture, they more engage in fishing, or things to do with the coastal economy, ranching. Some are engaging in salt mining and those kinds of things throughout the year, depending upon the season, right? In the Costa Chica, though, where I do some of my work, there are areas where the tourist economy is sort of a large portion of the work that Black Mexican folks are engaging in or trying to engage in, right? And that's because the Mexican government has promoted the region, specific parts of the region, right, as a tourist destination, mostly with sort of ecotourism and that kind of tourism. And so Black folks then in specific parts of the Costa Chica are really trying to figure out how to benefit from the tourist economy. And that's been difficult for a lot to do with because of a lack of certain resources, and the way in which politics and the social situation is sort of played out in the area.
What would you consider to be the major findings of your book, Blackness in Mexico?
Sure. I think for me, I think the issue has been about sort of the Mexican government's desire to recognize African descendants on the basis of culture. And this has been a tricky situation, right? African descendants have been excluded in Mexico, have been sort of invisibilized, have been forgotten in Mexico for a long time. But the reality is that Black Mexicans had been sort of incorporated into, right, that regional and national mixture for a long time. So to recognize or identify specific cultural traits is hard to do. And when I began working in the Costa Chica early on, right, the reality is that folks were talking about discrimination. They were talking about exclusion based on race and these kinds of things. The Mexican government decided that perhaps that wasn't the best way to go about recognizing Black folks in Mexico, because the myth, right, was that there was no racism in Mexico. And so rather, the Mexican government took on this project of cultural recognition. That meant that the Mexican government then was looking for these sort of unique cultural patterns, these unique lifeways, right, that would situate them in the cultural landscape similar to indigenous communities in Mexico. And what I found then was, or my argument at least, right, is that the project then for Black recognition really, I would argue, has less to do with recognizing Blackness and the history of Black people in Mexico, and more to do with trying to manage, right, the possible, I'd say, threat, if you know, for you know, perhaps overstating, but to manage the threat of Blackness, right, to the sort of myth of the Mexican nation. And so what I found then is that Black folks, because they don't have access to the means of representation, right, had to engage in this negotiation process with the Mexican government and their intentions of recognizing Black folks through these sort of cultural patterns or within this cultural context. And so the question then for me is, after that process is underway and as it begins to solidify, right, in what ways will Black Mexicans begin to look towards Africa or look towards other parts of the diaspora to represent themselves, because other ways of representing themselves have been sort of withheld or sort of, you know, taken out of the equation, right?
Mm-hmm. So to what extent in either the Costa Chica or other parts of the country are there Black people with roots in, for example, Belize or Panama or the Caribbean or even the United States?
Right. That's an interesting question. I think for a long time, Veracruz has been seen as sort of the sort of Black region of Mexico, right? And what a lot of people have argued is that's been possible because of Veracruz's connection to the Caribbean, right? It is Mexico's sort of Caribbean region. And so then the reality, I think, in Veracruz is that while there are many local Black Mexican folks, right, that originate from Mexico, there's also a mixture of folks coming in from other parts of the Caribbean. For example, you know, for a long time in Mexico, the myth of Blackness was about Cuba, right? So when someone would say, hey, someone in my family is Black or African descendant, they would say, oh, well, they must be from Cuba, right? And now there's a group of folks from Haiti, right, that are coming in to Mexico, and I think your listeners might be familiar with the situation of Haitian refugees or immigrants along the U.S.-Mexico border. But I think the reality is that in most regions in Mexico, right, Black folks are, right, the descendants of enslaved Africans that were brought there in the late 15, early 1600s, right? And so this idea that Black folks have come from other places, right, and moved and migrated and immigrated to Mexico really overshadows the ways in which Blackness has always been a part of Mexico, right? And Black folks have always existed in Mexico since the colonial moment, right? And that again is something that the Mexican government, the Project for Black Recognition, recognizes in a particular way, but that then competes with the sort of myth of Mexico as a nation of non-Black mestizos, right? Indigenous and Spanish, right?
Did the 2020 census in Mexico tell us anything that we did not know before?
I think it did. I think that so before the 2020 census, Mexico did sort of a trial run. They did what was called the inter-census in 2015. And the inner census in 2015 allowed for a population count, right? And I think in the inner census in 2015, they found that there were 1,381,853 people of African descent in the nation, right? It also allowed them to test some of the questions on how it was that people identified. For a long time, the idea of negro, right, or black was seen as sort of impolite. It was seen as sort of in bad taste because of the connotations, right, around blackness and the history of racism in Mexico. And so people weren't using that term. They were using Afro-Mexicano, they were using African descendant, and that term didn't really resonate with folks, right? So they tested the questions, and then in the 2020 census, they found that there were 2.5 million residents, right, that were of African descent. And that allowed them to sort of change some of these questions a little bit to try to capture the reality, right, of the way in which people actually identify. But the interesting thing in Mexico is that I would argue that 2.5 million number, which is 2% of the national population, might be understated, right? Because of the ways in which people, because of the social situation, racism, and these kinds of things, anti-blackness, I should say, people don't necessarily identify in public, right, with their, I would say, black roots, right? And that is to say then that when folks are obviously phenotypically, right, of African descent, they're counted by others, right? But when the phenotype is not that obvious, then they're oftentimes not counted by others, or they prefer not to self-identify, right? So I think until the situation around blackness changes in Mexico, I think we'll see the numbers being reported a lot less than the facts would actually represent. Right?
So who was Gaspar Yanga, and how is he viewed today in Mexico? Is he viewed along the lines, for example, of Vicente Guerrero, a president of African descent in the first few decades of the 19th century, or what?
Yeah, so Yanga, I think, it was popular at a particular moment, and he's become a figure for leading a revolt in Guerrero. I'm sorry, in Veracruz, during the colonial history of Mexico. The reality is, though, is that outside of Veracruz, right, that the figure, right, the idea, the myth, right, of Yanga isn't necessarily as I would say highlighted or embraced, right, in local communities. I think more and more as the Mexican government and educators and these kinds of things incorporate blackness into the historical curriculum in Mexico, right, I think figures like Yanga become sort of representative, right, of the black population in Mexico. But I think at the moment, my understanding in my own research, right, is that people in the Costa Chica, for example, were looking towards other heroes, right? Not just Vicente Guerrero, but popular figures from the Mexican Revolution, right? So there were people that I talked to that would suggest that Zapata, for example, right, was of African descent. Right. And whether that's, the people I talked to said, hey, we don't know how that person actually identified. Right. But what that tells me, though, is that Black folks in Mexico are actually looking back. Right. And they're reimagining the historical record. Right. To incorporate Blackness into places that it has been excluded, that it has been left out, that it has been sort of made invisible. Right. And so the question for me then is while there are important figures like Yanga, right, what other figures will emerge, right, and what other figures will Black Mexicans claim, right, as their historical heroes to resituate or reimagine themselves within the history of Mexico?
Finally, Professor Jerry of UC Riverside, author of the book Blackness in Mexico, for upcoming scholars, what gaps in the literature of your field do you think they could profitably work on?
Sure. I think there's still a lot to do, I think, in the historical context. And I know that there are a lot of folks, a lot of young folks who are getting their PhDs who are interested in the history of Blackness in Mexico. I think, though, sort of understanding the contemporary experience and really sort of avoiding or resisting, right, some of those pre-existing paradigms, to try to consider how do we take Mexico and Mexican history seriously, and then really think about how it is that Blackness then is an outcome of that history within Mexico, right? So I'll give you an example. When I first started doing work in Mexico, Black folks in the region sort of resisted the idea of the diaspora, right? They recognized that there were Black folks in other places, Africa to name one, but the idea is that Blackness was local, right? And so the question is, how do we look at the contemporary Black experience in Mexico through that sort of local lens, and then allow our theorizing and our understanding of Blackness in Mexico to really make sense within the context of that local lens, right?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to leave it there. Professor Jerry, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UC Riverside, author of the book Blackness in Mexico. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share my work with you.
We do too.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. It is time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined on the line by Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line are Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores, both of the Garifuna Museum in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, who are the Garifuna?
Well, the Garifuna, plural is Garinagu. But Garifuna, we are a mixture, an amalgamation of Africans, Carib Indians, and Arawak Indians. In about years before Jesus Christ was born, Dr. Van Sertima has chronicled the African presence in the Caribbean. And it's through that presence that this amalgamation started from the Caribs who left the Orinoco region in South America and traveled down to St. Vincent. The amalgamation took place in St. Vincent in the Grenadines. That is really the birthplace of our culture, of our people, of our ethnicity group. So we were born in St. Vincent. And subsequently, when the British started to dominate the Caribbean, St. Vincent was one of the targeted places because of the soil and the richness of the soil to grow sugarcane. So then the British wanted to take over, and a series of wars started that are referred to as the Carib Wars. And these Carib Wars was taking place the same time that the American Revolution was taking place here. Because at one point, the soldiers that were supposed to come to the U.S. to assist General Cornwallis in fighting the Minutemen, they couldn't leave St. Vincent because we were winning the war there with them against the British. So I'd like to think that if the Garifuna didn't exist, then the United States probably wouldn't, the Minutemen probably wouldn't have won that war, because the strength of the British troops was going to come from St. Vincent.
Yes, I wanted to add that during the time that we were on the island of St. Vincent, there were other groups that tried to enslave us, the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. So, but we fought everyone off. Every time the French would try to put a treaty, the British would come and destroy it. So,
subsequently, they assassinated our paramount chief, Joseph Chatoué. And after that event, then the British rounded up all the people that were fighting against them, the leaders and some of the followers, and they all took them to this barren island off the coast of St. Vincent called Balisao. Balisao is basically a rock in the middle of the ocean. Nothing grows there, there's no water. And it took about 5,000 of my ancestors there. And the idea was for us to perish on that island and die and become extinct. But that island at the time was owned by the French. So the French demanded that the British removed us from there. So once again, the British loaded us up on ships. We were supposed to head to Jamaica. But when we got to Jamaica, when the ship got to Jamaica, the then governor of Jamaica, refused the ship to enter or for us to land, because he was fully aware of the resistance that we gave them in St. Vincent. So the British didn't know what to do, so they dumped us off the coast of Rotan in Honduras. And that is where we disseminated to Guatemala, to Belize, to Nicaragua.
and what, you said what?
Yeah.
I also wanted to add that they tried to enslave us, but they weren't able to. Some of the pictures that we have here at the museum show us in shackles. They were trying to get us there to use us as slave labor, but that never happened. I wanted to make sure that that was touched upon.
And importantly, may I add that the Garinagu are the only Africanized group in the Western Hemisphere that were never enslaved. So we are the ones who defied the odds because we were never enslaved. So now the bulk of the Garifuna population here in the U.S. was in New York, which there's about almost 1 million Garinagu in New York.
Before and the export, use so many.
Is there some interference coming?
There seems to be an interference coming in. Okay, it's gone now.
Okay, so tell us, what is the Garifuna Museum? Where is it located? When did it begin? What does it contain? What are its hours? And does it have a website?
Yes, we do have a website, and the museum is holding all of our, as much as we can, of our culture in here. The address is 1523 West 48th Street, Los Angeles, and that's California 90062. Mr. Benny Davenport of the Blazers is the one that allows us to be housed here in this building. It's we have one room is our display room where we have the timeline. The other is our artifacts room. That's a favorite for a lot of Garinagu that come here. And we also have the library, which is a pinnacle place for people that want to come and learn more about our culture. It's about Garifuna, for Garifuna, and by Garifuna. The articles and the books that are in there. We have one more book called The Heroes Room, and we could touch upon that later. And I want to say it started in 2011. As far as what I was...
Yeah, it started, this is the brainchild of Mr. Ruben Reyes, who is from Honduras, and he's a passionate Garifuna. He's a linguist. He wrote the complete Garifuna dictionary, which is also available here on the site. But coming to this museum, to the Garifuna Museum in Los Angeles, upon entering the museum, you'll see depictions of our history and information of our origin and a timeline that gives you our trek from the Orinoco to Rotan, and then the dissemination from there to Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize. So we are, as a matter of fact, in Los Angeles, we have approximately 100,000 Garinagu living in Los Angeles, most residing in District 9. So
sorry, go continue, please.
Yes, so you come to the museum, and there are artifacts here that shows you our lifestyle, that shows you how we survived. It tells you about our daily life, the foods that we eat, and the things that we do daily, and our relationship to each other, and our governance, and more importantly, our spirituality, our connection to our ancestors and to the land.
I wanted to add that one of the purposes of me being here in the museum is to connect with the diaspora, the people that were after St. Vincent. We came to Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Belize. But every country that we're in, we assimilate the country that we're in. That's why I would like to speak to the generation like me. I was told that I speak American. The reason why we had to do that, excuse me, in 1944, when my father and mother came here, they said, "You're in America, you speak English." So for us not to have an accent would have been a purposeful for my father at that time. So this is what happened to a lot of people. So that's why I'm reaching out to the diaspora like me that got a separation of our culture. It's not good to start some of our fiestas or festivals and there's no knowledge of some of the things that we do, and then something from the culture that we live in gets interjected. That's why we're here at the museum, that we want these people that study geography, students, geography, history, that type of thing, so that we can show them the strength that we had, and that we are still strong today. And they can, I've had people that came from Ancestry.com, and they were looking for their family, and they saw all these people with Spanish last names. And they came to the museum and they said, "You mean I'm somebody?" Because they know we were never enslaved. After they get all this information, it changes their life around.
Yeah.
Now, go ahead.
Our current struggle in all the places that we live, our current struggle is because the Garifuna are indigenous to the Caribbean. And being indigenous, it tells you that we were occupying these lands before the state came, before the British came. We were occupying these lands. And now, today, they are expecting us to pay for the land that they found us on. So this is our struggle right now, is for our rights as indigenous people. And we have this because, like, currently in Belize, our indigenous lands are being sold to foreigners, and we have little recourse right now to fight against it. We are fighting against it because we are also in touch with the United Nations that give us some assistance in this struggle. And I always say the struggle will continue because there is no statute of limitation on reclaiming indigenous lands. So this is going to be a forever fight.
Let me ask you a question about the Garifuna language. You mentioned a Garifuna dictionary. Is it fair to suggest that the language includes words from the indigenous people of the Americas, includes words perhaps from ancestral Africa? If the latter, do you have any idea of what part of Africa do the words, or perhaps even the people, stem from?
Yeah, well, most of the Garifuna language is derived from our Arawak ancestry. And we do have quite a bit of African words in our language, usually from the Igbo, because we came almost all of coastal Africa. You can sense, you can see in our culture, but most of Garifuna culture is based on the Arawak culture, because historically the Carib Indians dominated the Arawaks, and they used some of the women as concubines and wives and have the children, and the women are the one who raised the children. So the language morphed into an Arawak language mostly, but we do have African in our language because we are obviously Africans.
I wanted to say that when we look at the DNA origins, a lot of the Garifuna are from Benin and Togo in Africa.
Now, you mentioned repeatedly that there are Garifuna in Guatemala, and we know that as we speak, there is a controversy about a recent election there. Do you have anything to add concerning the Garifuna stance on that controversy?
Well, first I must say that we are very marginalized in Guatemala, and our existence in Guatemala is based on one village, Livingston, that the Garifuna word for it is La Buga. So and I guess the politics of the country does affect us, but not directly because of our marginalization, and we have no power in Guatemala at all.
Now, what about the Heroes Room in the Garifuna Museum at 1523 West 48th Street in Los Angeles? What does it contain?
Well, we have on our walls pictures that were put there since the inception, 2008 to 2011 to 2013. We have TV Ramos on the wall. That was he was the beginning of the
Garifuna Settlement Day. That's celebrated on November 19th in Belize and here in LA.
We also have our more current heroes, which would be Paul Loco Lopez, and he's a test pilot for the United States.
He's a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, and he is the first black stealth pilot. Period.
And we have pictures of the hospital in Honduras that was started by Dr. Castillo. And a lot of people here, a lot of Garifuna people here helped put that together, and my brother knows a little bit more about that.
Yeah, mentioning Dr. Castillo, Dr. Castillo is also an adjunct professor at Harvard, and he got his medical degree in Cuba. And today he is also a minister, a congressman in Honduras. He's one of the people behind the new president of Honduras, and quite visible.
Also, we have some of the artists that are in on the wall. That's it's the Bootsy Rankin, who's a legendary singer from Belize. We have Laboreal, that he's a bass player. From what I understand, he still lives in Mexico. And he played with Van Morrison, Stevie Wonder, Lionel Richie. We also have beautiful paintings, voluptuous paintings of our people, painted by Penn Cayetano and Isaiah Nicholas. And we're going to acquire some more paintings very soon.
And we also have pictures of those of us who became Catholics, priests and nuns. We have a picture because, and that's extensive, because most Garinagu are Catholics. I mean, I guess you remain Catholic until you become conscious, and then you realize that.
I see. So finally, Bill Flores and Cynthia Lewis, remind us again of the website. What is the URL, and what are your future plans?
Okay. For the URL, okay, it's garifunamuseum.garinet.com. Garinet is GARINET.com.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Also, I wanted to just mention real quick, we have a very important book. It's about different factions of the military, the Army, the Navy. A young man named Edson Arsu, it took him 10 years to find who the Garinagu were in the United States military. And because we are listed under Hispanic last names. Some people posted that they were from Cuba, from Mexico, from all kind of countries. So he took the time to make the Garifuna Veterans of America. We are all in history, the history of America. So we do have profiles here that we ask people to send us if they have somebody in a faction of the military.
And before we go, our address again is 1523 West 48th Street in Los Angeles, zip code 90062.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there. Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores of the Garifuna Museum, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
We appreciate it.
If white immigrants can come to this country 50 years ago with nickels and dimes and no education, and come here and pool their little nickels and dimes and no education, and set up little stores, develop these stores into larger stores, develop this into an industry, which creates job opportunities for whites. Since Lincoln was supposed to have freed the black man 100 years ago, and today the black man, according to the government economist, has spending power of $20 billion per year. We feel that with the black man spending $20 billion a year, not setting up any businesses, not creating any industry, not creating any job opportunities for his own kind, he's not in a moral position to point the finger today at the white man and tell the white man that he's discriminating against him for not giving him a job in factories that he himself set up. If the black man has $20 billion, and these so-called Negro leaders are such geniuses that they can integrate white restaurants and integrate white factories and force themselves into that which the white man has set up, they should use this same ingenuity to show the black people how to pool our wealth and set up something of our own. And then we won't have to force our way into his anymore. One more thing I would like to point out concerning what he said about 125th Street. We don't waste our time on 125th Street, but you can reach more people in the street who want to change than you can in the bourgeoisie society, the bourgeoisie church, and the bourgeoisie circles. Our program is directed toward the man in the street. So we spend our time in the street, and what we do with that man, instead of trying to change the white man and your mind and make you accept us, we change the mind of the black man and make him accept himself. And as soon as he accepts himself, he'll solve his own problem. He won't be trying to force himself into your factory and into your bedroom and into your kitchen.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Anthony Jerry of UC Riverside. Get to your favorite black-owned bookstore today and find his book, Blackness in Mexico, Afro-Mexican Recognition and the Production of Citizenship in the Costa Chica. Thank you to Cynthia Lewis and Bill Flores from the Garifuna Museum of Los Angeles. Find them at 1523 West 48th Street and get your dose of history today. We also hope that you'll make it by the Electric Lounge in Venice this weekend for their Garifuna International Indigenous Film Festival. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to Sister Genesee on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. We hope to see you tomorrow at the Paddle Out for Peace in support of Sudan and Palestine. We'll be gathering starting at 10 a.m. at the Santa Monica Beach Pier Tower 24, located at 2030 Ocean Avenue. So come out and show your love and support. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.